Hello, and thanks for tuning in. As always, I'm Reverend JR, and you may be a bit confused if you're watching this on someone else's channel, because you probably expected that person to be here, and not me, greeting you. Well, do not dismay, for this is a collaboration, and I'm going to let Rorschach Justice explain to you why we're all gathered here today.
Hi, I'm Rorschach Justice. Recently, some of my right-wing fundamental Christian family members challenged me to respond to a debate between a 14-year-old self-professed disciple of Christ and a Columbia professor. This debate can be found on Blogspot as well as Facebook, and I will provide the links below. After reading through the entire thing, I think the professor did a pretty good job trying to explain to this indoctrinated poor child how evolution works and why creationism just fails as a science. However, I can see where it might be confusing to a 14-year-old kid, having been where this child is now in my past. Having grown up in a strict fundamental Baptist church and being homeschooled, I can understand how information from the outside is heavily filtered through the thou shalt not or the that is evil lenses. And so I'm going to try to peel back some of the darkness in her world and answer the questions that she poses as directly as I can and as fully as I can without making this video be 2.5 hours long. At the end of this video, I will include some clips from some good friends of mine who have volunteered to add in a few little clips going over their favorite evidences of evolution. I do hope you enjoy.
The link to the blog will be in the description. A debate with a Columbia University professor. Hi everyone! Just recently, Dr. Jason Lyle, former director of research for the Institute for Creation Research, started his own independent organization, the Biblical Science Institute. Daddy posted about Dr. Lyle on our Facebook page. That sparked a response from a professor from Columbia University in New York. Below is part of the conversation, some serious, some hilarious. After Dr. Lyle shared the post, more people got on and had more conversation with the professor. This professor is very smart and has impressive credentials. He was willing to have a conversation with me, so I took the chance to discuss biblical creation. The professor posted on his page that Dr. Lyle was his target. But since I engaged him, he took the chance to argue with me. He still wants to engage Dr. Lyle, though. Enjoy reading the conversation. Here is Professor Christy Blick's original comment. Jason's difficulty is that none of what he is saying is true. It's contradicted by readily checked evidence. There was no creation in 6 days, no Adam, no Eve, no fall, no global flood. At stake here are not different assumptions or worldviews. It is Jason's assumptions that are demonstrably not true. The great antiquity of the Earth is required by the huge array of events preserved in crustal geology, a history that even an undergraduate can appreciate if he or she takes the trouble to look. When Jason claims, as he often does, that we are looking at the same facts, he distorts reality. Creationism depends upon ignoring most of what is known and misrepresenting the rest. He will disagree. So I challenge him to put his faith on the line, to test his beliefs, to join me in the field to examine that which he denies. He will ignore the challenge and likely delete this post, because like all creationists, he is threatened by the possibility that he might be wrong. Jason may have earned a PhD in astrophysics. He appears not to have internalized the essence of science, an approach to inquiry that depends on testing explanations against data, not fitting data to predetermined conclusions. My first response. Nicholas, I would ask you to list one contradiction in Jason Lyle's argument. What evidence proves him wrong? How do you know that there was no 6-day creation, Adam, Eve, fall, or flood?
Those are some really good questions put forward by a 14-year-old. Now let me try to answer some of those for you. The reason we know that creation definitely did not occur in a literal 6-day period is because we have a pretty good understanding of how planets and stars form. Planets and stars are formed from collapsing dust clouds in space as they begin to spin due to the forces of gravity. Gravitational forces can pull these gases and dust particles together, forming stars and planets. Now we know this because of observations we have made through the Hubble telescope of planets and stars in their formation today. We don't fully understand the process, but we do have a very good idea, and it definitely takes more than 6 days.
Thank you for having me, Rorschach. I could have sworn that you got whacked by a blue guy, but whatever. I know you asked for my favorite piece of evidence supporting evolutionary biology, but I have to start with a quick note about assumptions. This is a favorite of creationists, and sure enough, our young debater leapt on the idea that both sides are making assumptions. However, she assumes too much about the assumptions of her opponents. Science as a method does not assume all that much. Deep time, for example, is a result of scientific study. What all of science assumes is just two things. First, there is a cosmos out there. Second, we can study it. That's it. From those two assumptions, all of science grows. It is true that scientific theories make additional assumptions beyond these two, but the assumptions of one scientific theory are the scientific study of another field in theory. Evolutionary biology, for example, assumes that we live on an ancient world because the laws and theories of physics and chemistry support it. But the disciplines of physics and chemistry test and formalize those laws and theories independently of evolutionary biology, and through them confirm that an ancient world is a valid assumption for evolutionary biology. On the other hand, biblical young earth creationism assumes that the Bible must be correct, at least on the major points, and therefore anything which conflicts with it must be incorrect and reinterpreted in a manner that does fit the biblical narrative. At least that's my understanding. Hopefully this helps clear up the issue on assumptions and demonstrates that the study of our universe through science is based only on assumptions that you would also have to accept in order to believe in young earth creationism. So on to why I'm supposed to be here. Evidence for evolution, and in particular my favorite evidence. Well, I have to say that my favorite, and in my humble opinion, the evidence that seals the fact of evolution as a preeminent theory in biology is the predictive power of evolutionary theory. In science, a theory is only as correct and powerful as its ability to accurately predict the world around it, and evolutionary theory is 10 for 10 here. Start from the beginning when Charles Darwin predicted that we would find fossils of human ancestry in Africa. He based this prediction on the existence of homologous structures between the great apes of Africa and humanity. Sadly, he didn't survive to see the treasure trove of transitional fossils from the Australopithecines to the hominids, but nevertheless, his theory was vindicated again with every single find. Next up, a personal favorite because it demonstrates the interdisciplinary nature of evolutionary theory. For a good long time, our fossil record had this awkward gap in it. 390 million years ago and earlier, we see fish skeletons as the only vertebrate fossils. 360 million years ago and more recently, we also have land vertebrates, the earliest of which would be called the tetrapods. We had no fossils that showed the transition. Where was the frish, as the creationists would say, half fish and half frog? Enter biologist Neil Shubin, who, among others, observed that lobe-finned fish had striking similarities to early tetrapods. Moreover, the tetrapods and lobe-finned fish were both most common in and around freshwater environments, as demonstrated through the geology of where their fossils were found. Based on this, he predicted we'd find our fish in a freshwater environment that dated back around 375 million years ago or so. Looking around through his geology textbooks, he located an exposed but relatively unexamined for fossils section of 375 million year old rock formed out of freshwater sediment. It took him 5 years of digging in that rock to discover Tiktaalik, our metaphorical frish. Sure enough, Tiktaalik had proto-arms that were half fin, half arm. It featured everything that you could want for an intermediate between lobe-finned fish and early tetrapods. Further digging in the region found more and more such critters showing finer and finer gradations of structural change between the aquatic lobe-finned fish and the early tetrapods. Evolution once again proved able to produce highly accurate and detailed predictions about life on Earth. And I've saved the best for last. You remember how I said that the ancient Earth was an assumption of evolutionary biology? Well, it is and it isn't. When Charles Darwin proposed evolution by natural selection, the strongest objection came from a gentleman known as Lord Kelvin. Using thermodynamics, Lord Kelvin demonstrated that the sun and Earth could only be some tens of millions of years old, not the hundreds of millions or even billions needed by evolutionary theory. Which is to say, if evolutionary theory were to be correct, it predicted an as yet undiscovered field of physics that would explain and justify the age of the sun and the Earth. Give it a few decades and we discovered nuclear physics, including the notions that the sun is a giant fusion generator and that nuclear fission takes place at the core of the Earth, both of which provide energy to the surface of the Earth, allowing for life to develop, and by extension, proving that the sun and the Earth could both be hundreds of millions or even billions of years old. That's right. Evolutionary theory predicted nuclear and particle physics. The notion of deep time is not only an assumption of evolution, it's a prediction that was proven correct so thoroughly that Lord Kelvin publicly retracted his criticism of the theory. I hope this shows that you can't pick at just one piece of science and not expect the rest to come crashing down upon you. Science is inherently interdisciplinary. The assumptions of one scientist's work is the work of another scientist, sometimes even in the same field. You cannot argue against evolution without arguing against basic physics, geology, and chemistry. They hang together, indivisible. The details may be proven wrong, but the broad sweeps of the models are as well demonstrated as our very existence. Once again, Rorschach, thank you for having me on, and I hope this isn't too long that you can't use it.
To answer your question on how we know there is no Adam and Eve, at least in the biblical sense, I'm going to read to you from a website that I found called Why Evolution is True, WordPress.com. And I'll include the link in the description below. It reads as follows. Mitochondrial DNA points to the genes that originally trace back to a single female ancestor who lived about 140,000 years ago, but that the genes on the Y chromosome trace back to one male who lived about 60 or 90,000 years ago. Further, the bulk and the genes of the nucleus all trace back to different times, as far back as 2 million years. This not only shows that any Adam and Eve, in the sense of mitochondrial and Y chromosome DNA alone, must have lived thousands of years apart, but it also shows there simply could not have been two individuals who provided the entire genetic ancestry of modern humans. Each of our genes coalesces back to a different ancestor, showing that, as expected, our genetic legacy comes from many different individuals. It does not go back to just two, regardless of when they lived.
Is it true that Dr. Lyle says that we look at the same evidence? In what ways does this distort reality? We do look at the same evidence as evolutionists and creationists. We both look at the Grand Canyon, for example. We as creationists realize that it is full of catastrophic events around the time of the global flood. I know you deny that reality, but you cannot dismiss evidence simply because you disagree. At least some evolutionists believe that the Grand Canyon was formed by the Colorado River flowing through the Grand Canyon over millions of years. I know that other evolutionists may have a different theory, but I am using this as one example. We both look at the same evidence, yet arrive at two very different conclusions. What evidence is Dr. Lyle ignoring?
So you realize that the Grand Canyon was the result of a global flood, and we are just ignoring that evidence. Well, kiddo, you got that entirely backwards. It is not the quote-unquote evolutionists, which biological evolution has very little to do with geology, but it's your words, not mine. The evidence the Grand Canyon provides is largely ignored by young Earth creationists because they disagree with it. Now, there are several ways we know there was no global biblical flood. A popular YouTuber named Aaron Raw, someone whom I have learned a great deal from, did a very detailed series on this exact subject.
Likewise, I asked Wildwood Claire to help me with this video, but she referred me to another geologist, Tim Helbel, who identifies as Christian. In one of the recommended sources, Helbel wrote that most of the pioneering natural scientists and geologists of the Renaissance and late modern era, a group which included many pious Christians, expected that their field work would provide evidence of the biblical flood, reflecting a catastrophic event in Earth's history of only thousands of years. However, as they discovered the interrelated dynamic processes of the rock cycle and pieced together Earth's history from the vertical sequence of rock layers around the world, they concluded that the Earth must be older than thousands of years. Furthermore, they couldn't identify a single layer of rock or sediment that fit with the global flood occurring early in human history. By the early 20th century, most leading Christians accepted the great age of the planet Earth.
In his video series, he explains how fields of study like geology, meteorology, and even mythology all disprove the Noah flood account. Things like plate tectonics that would have torn the planet in half, evidence like fossilized coral reefs that extend 1,000 feet above sea level. Knowing the rate at which coral grows and the conditions that it requires, we can quite confidently claim these formations were not formed in a single year as a result of a flood. Even if we were to set aside that scientific evidence, the fact that the biblical account is plagiarized from previous myths, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, is pretty clear evidence that the Noah story contained in the Bible is a fairy tale.
Hello, I'm Chocolate Hat, and here is some of my favourite evidence for evolution. We all love cats and dogs, lambs and calves, or whatever. We eat cows, pigs and sheep, bananas and large orange carrots, fleshy squashes, soft and green cabbage, corn and wheat. We breed chickens and pheasants, carp, hamsters, rats, mice, and the list goes on. All these were bred by humans from wild species. But let's consider dogs. Our best friends' ancestors were wild and effective predators. Their cousins still are. How then did humans come to live so close to these creatures? Humans were creating breeds of dogs millennia before we discovered the science of evolution by natural selection. This process of breeding we called artificial selection. I wager that not many people have heard of a dog called Old Hemp. Born in 1893, died in 1901, living in West Woodburn, Northumberland. Nor will they have heard of his owner, Adam Telfer. Yet instantly we recognise any of this old dog's descendants, the lean, poised and acutely intelligent animal that is used across the Anglophile reaches of the globe to herd sheep. A dog so intelligent and so full of stamina that it stands above all other herding animals, the Border Collie. Adam Telfer knew what traits he wanted from his dogs, Meg and Roy, who were, through breeding, already collies. He wanted a quiet but lively and attentive dog who could naturally get the sheep to move how he wanted. Old Hemp was the offspring who embodied this combination of traits and is now considered the progenitor of all Border Collies alive today. This is one example of how humans artificially selected desired traits, but this is only possible because of natural selection. Each generation of any living thing will be comprised of individuals who, though they are all the same species as their parents, are slightly different. One puppy might be noisy and impatient, one quiet and patient, one black and one white. Natural selection happens on the scale of populations and over generations and generations of environmental pressures. The most fit survive and their traits succeed, and the least fit eventually die off and their traits get lost. Here then we have natural selection and artificial selection, but really the processes that power them are both exactly the same. How then did we come to learn to breed animals? In short, I don't know, but I expect that we first observed how, as we came to coexist with animals, their behaviour and maybe even their appearance changed. Maybe at first the wolf's tail drooped and it started barking, and then maybe after some generation the creature's colour started changing. Now, as and when you get dogs rewilding themselves, over generations they will soon revert to being feral, uniformly coloured. Their tails will raise once again and they will stop barking and possibly end up being very wolf-like. If you continue to isolate animals that were recently of the same species, such as chihuahuas and grey wolves, there will be different pressures upon each. They will continue to diverge, and there will be a point where they are too different to interbreed again. These creatures will have evolved. This can be directly observed in fast evolving species, such as bacteria species. Moving on. Dendrochronology is the analysis of tree rings and is an accurate method of dating. Fossilised and petrified forests can be dated relatively, and we have continuous dendrochronology stretching back for some 11,500 years. Dendrochronology helps accurately piece together threads of time from different era and helps calibrate radiometric and other dating techniques. Although there are fossilised Jurassic forests that can be relatively dated within various separate regions and petrified forests from tens of thousands of years ago that can likewise be compared, we don't have an unbroken chain from now back to the Jurassic period or older. However, we have a chain of unbroken tree rings stretching back about 11,500 years. That's already about twice as old as most young Earth creationists would have us believe the Earth is old. We are obviously confident that as and when more and more petrified and fossilised trees are found, and if we will be able to make an unbroken chain of tree rings, that it will all line up and confirm the dates of prehistoric trees and the surrounding flora and fauna, leading to another layer of confirmation for evolution. However, until there is the complete record, there will always remain the chance, albeit impossibly small, that it doesn't all fit together as hypothesised. That would mean that there is a problem with the theory of evolution. This ability to falsify the theory is essential in being able to say that it explains nature, which leads me to my third and final favourite piece of evidence for evolution, the fact that it does all fit together to make an elegant and cohesive theory. Each branch of science that forms what we call the theory of evolution due to natural selection is comprised by hypotheses that have been created by observing nature, identifying laws and patterns, proposing hypotheses, and then testing them to attempt to falsify them. Each dataset has to be consistent with the theory. If not, then the theory is wrong. Science is about collecting data, but also testing and verifying the data and the interpretations drawn from the data. The scientific method not only sets out to collect data, test data, but demands that falsifiable predictions are made based on the data that you have collected. What is particularly beautiful about the theory of evolution is that it is the most well-supported theory in science. Each branch of science and each piece of evidence can be cross-referenced, and together there is a mesh of interweaving and interconnecting lines of evidence, so much more than one person can study in one lifetime. The list of disciplines in science that verify evolution is huge, from paleontology, archaeology, microbiology, comparative biology, genetics, medicine, immunology. Even your flu jab and the type of antibiotic you require when you're ill is informed by the evolution of bacteria. In fact, so great is the influence of science that is involved with evolution that if evolution were not true, everything you take for granted, such as the shape of rocks around you, the composition of the soil, fossil fuels, medicine, the air you breathe, the slate on your roof, the stone in your house, the porcelain of which you eat, the lime in your cement, the soft cotton in your underpants and your clothes, the alcohol in your beer and your wine, the yeast in your bread, the cat, the dog, the meat and the vegetables you eat, the wheat in your bread, the soft and fleshy fruit and veg you eat, and a whole lot more would be a mystery. If evolution is not true, then these things are all based on science that is false. Yet they exist, and the science works. Thank you very much.
I guess the real question here is, are you going to dismiss the evidence merely because you disagree? When it comes to the Grand Canyon, the general consensus is that the canyon formed between 5 and 6 million years ago. The canyon itself contains several rock layers, and these layers date between 250 million and 2 billion years old. Now, how we know how old these layers are is by several different methods, but one of the ways is we can test their age with a high degree of accuracy, using tests like radiometric dating. These give scientists an accurate age of the rock sample. Now, I understand that most young Earth creationists make the claim that radiometric dating is unreliable and you can't use it. But once again, Google comes to the rescue. An article written by David Bailey for ScienceMeetsReligion.org entitled How Reliable Are Geological Dates clarifies many of these misconceptions. He explains how the test works, mistakes that were made with the testing, and corrections that were made. After all, science is a self-correcting mechanism. He goes on to answer specific claims made by many creationists to discredit the dating method. Claims such as radiometric dates rely on index fossils, and these dates were assigned before radioactivity was discovered, when in fact radiometric dating is based off half-lives of radioactive isotopes. These half-lives have been observed and measured for the last 40 to 90 years. So we can be pretty confident that this test is quite accurate.
I don't do much video recording, I guess I'll start with that. So I guess my basic and most favorite evidence for evolution is one of the most basics of science, which is observation. I remember as a very young child, there was an illustration in a magazine of human skulls over periods of time from archaeological finds across the world. And I bought it right then and there. I can't even remember how old I was. I don't even think I was 10 yet. And to me, that's all it really took. I've never read Darwin personally. But again, I didn't have to. This is something that I was taught that I understand. I've seen a coelacanth, obviously, not personally, but nonetheless, these creatures are real. And how you can look at something like the coelacanth and not understand evolution, or look at something like the fossil record and not understand evolution is just, to me, asinine. How people don't look at the theory of evolution and evidence like the fossil record and creatures like the coelacanth and all these other examples of not just our evolution, but evolution in general, to me is ridiculous. We have a tailbone. We have, when we get goosebumps, our hair stands up. That's a way we fought against cold. It doesn't really work anymore because obviously we're not covered in fur. A lot of us develop spinal problems because we're still getting used, even after all these years, we're still getting used to standing in an upright position. Our appendix, that's an evolutionary organ that we no longer need. It's just there now. Same thing with our tailbone. Our tailbone is just a little point now, but that used to be part of our tail. We don't have that anymore. By the way, you can look this up. We harbor, I think it's something like 98 or 99% or some really, really high numbers. I know it's in the 90s of the genetic code for a tail. So in other words, it's still there. And this shows up in humans in the idea of vestigial tails. Like if you can go look that up too. Yeah. And that's very good evidence for your perfect God too. Vestigial tails. Nothing says I didn't fuck up like, whoops, you have a tail. And I suppose that's just more than a couple examples. But nonetheless, to me, I did have to do a little research for this. But honestly, the fossil record, pure and plain and simple. Just look at the motherfucker. It's real. Whether you want to believe it or not.
And that will conclude part 1 of our response to a girl who had questions about why evolution is true. Please check the description box below for links to all the channels who helped collaborate on part 1. Part 2 will be out in another week or two. Again, there's a lot of information to unpack in this article, and I want to make sure we do so adequately and effectively. And as always, this has been Reverend JR, thanking you for tuning in and signing off.